Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of Education. It's Tuesday, May 24th, 2011, the end of the school year. You can tell our crowds are thinning out a little just because of time constraints. Those of you here, we're certainly delighted to have you here. Our special guest today is Steve Denning, the author of The Leader's Guide to Radical Management. Hi, Steve, and thanks for coming. You'll need to turn your mic back on. There you go.
Thanks for organizing this.
Sure, glad to have you here. So the Future of Education is sponsored by Learn Central and Blackboard's WIMBA and Illuminate, which in July will become Blackboard Collaborate. It's also sponsored by the Web 2.0 Labs project, which includes Classroom 2.0 and those other community websites that you see there. Coming up at the ISTE show in Philadelphia, Saturday the 25th, our annual EduBloggerCon, 5th year, the large unconference for those in education interested in social media and just connecting. So that's free. It is Saturday, June 25th from 8 to 5 p.m. at the Pennsylvania Convention Center. You do not need to be registered for ISTE to come, but either way you are most welcome. And that's at edubloggercon.com. Of course, we'll be doing the Bloggers Cafe, just the ever-popular Bloggers Cafe, and our ISTE Unplugged program. If you've never presented at ISTE and you want to, now's your chance. Go ahead and sign up at ISTE Unplugged. We have announced the dates for the 2011 Global Education Conference, November 14th to 18th, 24 hours a day, 5 days. This last year we had presentations from 62 countries, over 400 presentations. We were accused of not understanding what a keynote was because we had over 60 keynotes, but there's a fun story there. Anyway, globaleducationconference.com again this year. Hope you'll join us. Coming up on the Future of Education tomorrow, Sir Ken Robinson comes back to talk about his revised version of Out of Our Minds. Next week, James Bosco asks, is there participatory learning? Interesting question. We'll see what he says. On June 1st, we have our unschooling panel. And then Cal Newport talks about how to be a high school superstar. Lots of fun sessions coming up. We did add a couple. Carol Black on July 7th to talk about her fascinating film called Schooling the World. And on August 2nd, Jane Nelson and Mary McGuire are going to talk about education, psychology, and democracy. And Jane is the author of the Positive Discipline series of books based on the Adler and Dreiker's philosophies, largely psychology for democratic ages. It'll be very interesting to see how that translates to some of the larger forces we're seeing in the world today and building social structures for coming to consensus and action in democracies. Anyway, lots of fun. Hope that there's one of those that you'll enjoy and you'll consider coming back. All of our recordings are up. Chris Guillebeau, of course, last week talked to us about his book, The Art of Nonconformity. Mark Fensky on The Winner's Brain. Lots of others there. All of those in full Illuminate recordings and also MP3s at futureofeducation.com. If this is your first time in Illuminate, it is participative. There are little emoticons at the bottom of the participant window that you can click on. I'm going to click on the clapping hand right now, thanking Steve for coming. The smiley face, the thumbs down, the confused look. The hand with the green up arrow is to raise your hand to take the microphone, which we're glad to have you do, or you can put your questions in the chat. I'm going to recommend that you go to View Layouts and switch your layout to the wide layout. There's no way to have Illuminate default to that, but it is a much better layout for watching the chat. The new version of Illuminate comes out at the end of June. It will be called Blackboard Collaborate 11, and it's going to be really, really fun. So don't worry, you don't have to learn too much here because all of this interface is going to change in what I think are pretty brilliant ways. This is a chance for those of you who are listening live to let us know where you're participating from. Look for the wand with the red star at the end. Click on that. It's to the left of the map, and then click on the map. Feel free to give a shout out in the chat as well so Steve can know where you're participating from. Canada, United States. Bill, I'm thinking, is that you in the Philippines? Greg in Kansas, Bill in Manila. Oh, good. Glad to have Perth, Australia here, Santa Barbara. Wherever you are, or if you're listening to the recording, again, we really appreciate that you've taken time to participate. So Steve, this was a really fun book for me. I have an advanced copy, an advanced uncorrected proof, not for resale copy. So I don't know if you changed much, but I will say that several times in the book I kind of shouted out, hooray, oh, somebody's talking about this. How long has the book actually been out, and what kind of a response have you been getting to it?
Well, it came out in October last year, so 6 months, and I got quite a strong support when it was published, and a whole lot of people bought it. And the message, of course, though, is quite profound. It's basically saying that the way that Fortune 500 is being run, those companies are being run in a totally wrong fashion. The way and by implication, the way the government is being run is quite wrong, and the way the education system is being run is quite wrong, and the way the health sector is being run is quite wrong. So this message was, as the title of the book implies, this is a radical message. And so there was an initial kind of jolt as people thought, well, this is kind of quite startling. And as time has gone on, and I've been steadily blogging about it, currently on the Forbes blog, and people have started to see that this is actually not just one of 11,000 books that are published on management each year, but something that does transform the way we look at the whole subject. And so it's growing as a movement. This is a movement to change the world, to change the way the workplace functions. And I give myself 10 years to do that. So we're kind of 6 months into a 10-year change plan. And I'm very excited that a whole lot of people all around the world have heard this message and seen the implications and are starting to make it happen in their world. And that's what this is about. Obviously, I can't change the world alone, but I can spark the imaginations and spark the insights of people that they can see what's wrong with the way things are currently being run and get into a new mode and inspire other people to get into that mode, to create champions who actually make this revolution happen.
So I know you didn't come on the show having written a book about education, but I think you and I have both seen pretty substantive parallels there. What's intriguing about education in this context is that it sort of exists at two levels. You know, one level is how you actually think about how you run education and the environment in which the teachers work. And then the second level is the environment in which the students operate, who then will become members of society who will join workforces. So we're going to try and sort of make the connections today. And as you and I talked in the pre-show chat, I hope you'll guide me to the degree that you're comfortable about that. But I would like to make some what I think are some fun connections. And so does it matter that in education that the output is human?
Well, that's what this whole thing is about. In fact, you can look at the 20th century as an experiment to see, suppose we treated people as things. What could we do? How far would we get? Suppose we treated employees as human resources, namely things. Suppose we treated customers as demand that we could manipulate. Suppose we, instead of communicating to them as people, suppose we told them what to do and just gave them instructions like machines. How far could we get? And, I mean, for about 2/3 of the century, it seemed to be working out not too badly. The standard of living in the developed countries, anyway, was had improved enormously. So, in that sense, it wasn't doing too badly for about 2/3 of the century. But by the end of the century, the whole thing had come unraveled, in that the workforce was tired of being treated as human resources, and the customers actually had a great deal more power. Instead of being essentially powerless and being dictated to by big corporations, there'd been this massive shift in the balance of power from the seller to the buyer. The customer is now essentially the boss, because the customer suddenly, through the internet, had reliable, instantaneous information about what the options were, and through global competition had multiple options, and could moreover communicate with other customers and find out what was going on and speak back to big organizations. So suddenly customers were in charge of the marketplace, a staggering shift in the balance of power. And so the whole model of treating customers and employees as things fell apart. And so what we're seeing now is the dismantling of that experiment, and a whole new set of organizations being run in a very different way, in which you actually treat employees as people and you treat customers as people, and you realize that unless you do that, you are not going to survive as an organization. And so that's what's happening in the private sector. And paradoxically, what we see in the education sector is that at the very moment that the private sector has decided that this way of running things, of treating people as things, is actually counterproductive and disastrous. It's growing in strength and support within the education sector. So it's really quite paradoxical that these things are happening in sort of contrary directions.
I'm going to suggest something, and I'd be curious to know if you think it might answer that question. It feels to me that sort of one of the responses to losing control of institutions and organizations that have held control is to grip tighter. Could that be a part of the story here? Could it be that these are sort of the last gasp efforts to maintain control?
Absolutely. I mean, the private sector, you see this very much. I mean, some organizations are absolutely horrified by what I'm talking about, and saying that everything that you know and love doing, the way in which you're running your whole organization, is actually driving your organization into the grave. That is not a welcome message for many people. And one reaction, as you say, is to pull back and to tighten and to run faster and to grip tighter and to move and to see whether we can't, through more effort, sort of get back to where we were. But that age is gone. That whole it's over. And but in the education sector, I think to some extent you don't have the same kind of sanctions in the private sector. This change is being driven by the economic solvent. The fact that these old organizations are increasingly unproductive, and the returns on their assets is declining, their life expectancy is declining, they're going out of business faster and faster. The commitment of the people doing the work, only 1 in 5 people fully engaged in their work. I mean, these are disastrous results, and the stock market has taken account of it. So organizations like Apple and Amazon and Salesforce.com, I mean, having massive gains recognized by the stock market, whereas the old stalwarts like Walmart and GE basically struggling just to stay in place and actually declining at fairly remarkable rate. So in the private sector, I mean, the sanctions are more immediate and more direct, and so one has people's attention. In the education sector, I mean, one can go on doing the wrong thing for really quite a long time without the consequences of that becoming apparent. Just as in the public sector, one can see organizations grinding along for very long periods without the consequences of their action. Someone's asking, Walmart is declining. Wow. Well, I mean, Walmart, the share price of Walmart is barely what it was 10 years ago, whereas Apple is 30 times and Amazon is about 10 times and Salesforce.com is 10 times. These are not tiny little differences. These are massive differences. And the reason why Walmart's going out of business is basically Amazon is able to get you the same product cheaper. And Walmart's game plan, business model was always, we have this big box and you drive 40 minutes to go to our big box and we'll get you the cheapest product. Amazon can now have it delivered in 2 days free, and you have a cheaper product and you don't have to bother to drive 40 minutes. So basically Walmart business model is in real trouble. So, and GE, the organization, if you said who is the best exponent of traditional management, it's GE. Their share price is half of what it was 10 years ago. They are basically going the wrong direction. So, John is asking, Apple is for tight control. This new way of managing that I'm talking about is actually highly disciplined, but it also leaves a huge amount of scope for individual initiative. It's, first of all, focusing the organization on delighting customers, not just satisfying customers, but enchantment, joy, happiness, creating an experience where the customer wants to do more business with the organization. That becomes the whole goal of the organization. And focusing the organization on delighting the customer, you can say that someone here is saying Steve Jobs is a dictator, but he is focusing the whole organization on delighting the customer. And you can see in a whole series of quite different sectors, in retail computing, in music, in mobile phones, now in tablets. This way of running an organization where you have the whole organization focused on delighting the customer, you get a dramatically transformation of the sector. Apple has 4% of the mobile phone market, but 50% of the profits, because people absolutely have to have an iPhone. So it's running organizations so that they delight the customers. The analog in the education sector is to delight the students. So to focus the whole education activities on learning the students, putting the students first. At present, what the education sector, health sector is run for the convenience of the administrators and convenience of testing and simplicity of testing. This is about reversing that and saying this is about creating learning experiences for children, or it's creating well-being for the patients in the health system, not about the convenience of the doctors or the convenience of the administrators. So it's about a different focus of the organization. The commentators, I think, are right that there are some aspects of Apple that are not particularly attractive. So I wouldn't say that they're doing everything of what I'm saying in the book, but they are an exponent of a number of key aspects of it. I would say sales, I don't talk about Apple in the book, but I do talk about a company like Salesforce.com, which is more faithfully implementing all of the principles in the book.
So I'm going to jump in for a second here, because R. Walcott's asking a really good question, but I want to go back to John's first question. So John says, Walmart is declining? Wow. It feels to me like there's some really significant parallels between the total quality movement and the current time. In the 80s and 90s, the total quality movement, we really wanted things to be different, but a lot of the same practices, but it felt as though traditional business was doing quite well. Now I think what you're saying is there's this, for many people, sort of invisible change that's occurring, which is, you've just described, that these companies are actually not doing very well. They're not lasting very long, and they're not making very much money. And that's going to surprise us. And those things that, a lot of those techniques that were developed in the total quality movement or the time, are kind of part of this larger story of employee involvement that now becomes critical. Is that a fair comparison?
Yes, but yes. The quality movement is clearly one of the antecedents of this kind of thinking, and a huge part of it comes from them, of focusing on quality, of working in an iterative fashion to get continuous improvement. I mean, Toyota is clearly an exponent of doing those things. But I have gotten into some fights with some of the quality people by pointing out, for instance, that Ed Deming, who is one of the great saints of the quality movement, if you read his 14 principles, there is not a single reference to the customer. The customer is kind of absent from his vision of the 14 most important things that an organization should do. And what's dramatically different about this way of running organizations is that it's totally focused on the customer. Everything begins with the customer. What is the customer thinking? What are the hopes, the fears, the dreams? How can we solve the problems of the customer? How can we understand what the customer might want if we could deliver it, and then surprising the customer by actually delivering it? That thinking, which one might say that it was implicit in what was in the quality movement, was not explicit. And so I'm getting into fights with the quality people by pointing that out. But I mean, it is quite important to actually make it explicit, because that in the current situation where there's been this huge shift in power from the seller to the buyer, the customer is the boss. The manager isn't the boss. The teacher isn't the boss. The administrator isn't the boss. The customer is now the boss. And so making the whole organization revolve around that fundamental insight becomes the key. And that, if you read the quality literature, was implicit and occasionally explicit, but it wasn't the driving force. What's new about this is and different perhaps from the quality movement, is to make this much more central.
So I think that's explicit. A good lead into our Walcott's question, which is schools following the business sector. Are you saying schools should follow the new business model? If the new business model is delighting the customer, is the answer yes?
Yes, the answer is yes. I mean, it's putting students first. I mean, it has to be adapted, because I mean, students aren't customers, and to some extent, they don't know what they need or want. But it's creating learning experiences for students so that they become prepared for a life in which they are going to have 10, 15, 20, 30 jobs throughout their whole life. The idea that you're preparing someone to have one or even two careers is gone. It's about creating this learning capacity, and so it's a shift from teaching to learning. It's a shift from we're the teachers and we've got the answers to here are the students, and how can we inspire in them this capacity to adapt and cope and innovate and learn how to have these multiple careers which they get to live with, and will be so. In the same way, in the private sector, it's this shift from big corporations saying we're making this stuff and you're going to buy what we make, and we're going to persuade you to buy it through advertising or whatever means. I mean, you take what we make. In that case, there's a shift to saying, we want to understand what are your problems, what are your hopes and dreams, how can we be responsive and do less of what's irritating you and do a lot more of what's thrilling you and fascinating you and enchanting you. And so the analog in education is it's a shift from teaching and delivering messages and components to inspiring this learning capability within the students.
Albeit more slowly or with difficulty because of the lack of sort of true market forces. Then it is the voices of the students, the parents, and the teachers, now voices that have gained power, that should sort of be demanding that the system provide them with better circumstances or delight them.
Yeah. I mean, well, I would say create inspiring learning experiences. Create learning experiences where you can measure that students are actually increasing skill, and putting in place measures that enable the students themselves to see whether they are in fact learning and whether they are in fact getting better. I mean, the trick in this is to not have the student, not having the teachers testing the students, but having the students themselves see, am I learning? Am I getting better? Am I becoming more competent? Am I gaining skills? Am I acquiring capabilities? Once you provide the students with that kind of understanding, then you start to have a virtuous circle where people are wanting to learn. If it's, how do I beat the teacher? How do I cheat on this exam? How do I get a leg up on the SAT scores? Then you're in a whole different ballgame from when you're having students trying to see, how can I learn more? How can I gain more capability? How can I take on more difficult challenges? How can I acquire capability to do those kinds of things? This is a very different dynamic.
So in the book you use
we're trying to create
the phrases that we're going from shareholder capitalism to customer capitalism. In my mind, I translated that we're going from institutional education to individual education. Do you like that? Would you modify that in any way?
I tend to talk about, say, it's a shift from teaching to learning, but I mean, yes, in the sense that teachers are part of institutions, and learning is individual. We're talking about
in the same. We're actually in a part of the book that the delighting clients part, and you make a connection for me. I think it's in that part of the book of. And I'm going to represent this, say, by sort of 3-letter blocks, alphabet blocks, so A, B, and C. And A is where we are, and let's say C is making money. And we often try to go directly from A to C. So the main goal is making money. And I think what you say is that you go from A to B, which is delighting customers. You'll naturally then go from B to C, which is appropriately making money. That, to me, resonates very closely with what I would say about education, which is we talk a lot right now about going directly to improving the economy by improving education. We're trying to get to C, improving the economy. But it feels like the B, which is educating the individual or providing them with learning opportunities or helping them become better people, would naturally lead to a better economy. So do you think that we're missing that message in education as well, that we're so focused on students to improve our economy that we're missing the opportunity to help them become more whole individuals?
Well, I certainly think there needs to be more emphasis on that. And I agree very much with the A, B, and C schema that you laid out for the private sector. I would put it even more strongly in the sense that, focusing on trying to make money actually leads organizations to do things which get in the way of making money. In other words, if I tell you, Steve, my object in life is to take money from your wallet and put it in my wallet, then you, as someone who is about to do business with me, is immediately wondering, oh my gosh, what am I doing talking to this person? How do I protect my wallet from this person? It doesn't lead to in fact, it gets in the way of a productive relationship. And if you do that in an organization, you encourage people up and down the hierarchy to do things that get in the way of building sensible relationships. So it's not just that it's a slow way of getting from A to C, it's actually a counterproductive way of getting from A to C. So an oblique goal, delighting the customer, studies have been done to show that it's much more profitable than focusing the organization on trying to make money. So it's kind of a stronger version of what you described. And in the education sector, I think the link between improving the economy and educating children is there are a number of causal links sort of between those two steps. And if you look at what's happening in say the job market, I mean, obviously it's a huge shock for many graduates. Recent graduates joining the job market now that there are no jobs for them, and so that's a shock. And you start to ask yourself why that's so. It's not because all those graduates had a poor education. It's because you look at the statistics between 1980 and 2005, the companies older than 5 years produced zero net jobs. Zero net jobs by companies older than 5 years. That's basically all the companies in the Fortune 500. The jobs they created were balanced out by jobs that were lost. So all of the jobs, 40 million jobs in that period, were created by firms younger than 5 years, startups. And so what we're looking at is an economy which is not producing jobs. Large organizations have stopped producing jobs because they're being run in a way that actually takes as many jobs away as it creates. And so to think that we're going to fix the economy by training people, I mean, that's part of the longer-term solution, but it's certainly not going to fix the economy in the short run. The short run, short to medium-term solutions and jobs are going to be about actually creating organizations that do generate jobs, that are not losing jobs as fast as they are creating them. So they are related, but there are many causal links.
So I wanted to shift a little to your
educating
material on self-organizing teams,
improving the economy.
I'm very curious as to how you say in the book, why is it teams keep being rediscovered? And I'm curious if we have sort of cognitive blinders or limitations that often drive us toward bureaucracy rather than providing the freedom for sort of self-organizing teams. Are you seeing these grow, or are we going to see sort of another cycle of teams being rediscovered, then going away, and then having to come back at a future time?
Well, I hope it doesn't happen again. I mean, it has been going on for 190 years, ever since Mary Parker Follett started lecturing on teams in the 1920s. And so every 10 years, 15 years or so, somebody would rediscover teams. And I mean, the book, I argue that the reason why that's happening is that management thinking is an interlocking set of assumptions. Traditional management is this interlocking set of assumptions. You're making money for the shareholders, and the best way to do that is to control individuals, have bosses controlling individuals, and have them focused on making money for the companies. And so there are a set of interlocking assumptions. Changing that is not going to be effective simply by saying, well, let's have teams. You actually have to change the goal of the organization and the values of the organization and the way that managers, people in the organization communicate with each other. In other words, there's a set of systemic changes that are needed all at once. And so in one sense, nothing in my book is new. Every one of the 7 principles I talk about there have been tried and tested and proven in many different organizations for quite long periods. But what is new is doing all of these things at the same time, delighting the customers, having self-organizing teams, having values that support that, communicating not through commands but through conversations, and coordinating the work not through bureaucracy but in these short iterative cycles. Doing all of those things together, suddenly you get something that is robustly sustainable and that has the capability to withstand the different set of assumptions from the traditional management. So I think if we see it in this way, that we're talking about a systemic change, a whole new set of assumptions about how to run organizations, which actually interlock, are interdependent, and if you do them all together, you are able to, in a sense, like getting out of Earth's gravity, getting out of the gravity of traditional management, you're able to get into an orbit, and what you see in these organizations, they just start flying. They start operating at a different level of capability. So that is what I think is exciting, and what gives me hope that we can, in fact, not fall back into a traditional way of doing things, but actually establish a new normal.
The shifts in power from the internet are dramatic enough to kind of radically alter things. But I'm left with this question of, do we have kind of dual narratives that run in our brains, kind of control versus agency, that often lead us back in cycles to providing more power and then taking it away. And I don't want to assume that you would agree with that, but if that is true, are there things that we can do to help keep ourselves focused on allowing agency and allowing these teams to function, where we might kind of have natural desires to control?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we grow up in families where our parents are the bosses. Our parents are telling us what to do, and we all grow up in that environment. Organizations have been run this way for thousands of years. So there's all this muscle memory that we have to kind of lose, have to forget, and develop muscle memory of a different way of running organizations. But my sense is that it's happening. I mean, you can see it in the political sphere in the Middle East. You can see it and in Europe, and it's. There's a whole capability of communicating social media that just wasn't there. I mean, even 5 years ago. It's amazingly how recent this is. I'm looking at my book, which was written in 2005 on storytelling, and realized that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube hardly existed then. This has all happened extraordinarily recently. So, as the impact of that is felt, I think this is going to accelerate the process of losing the muscle memory of the old way of doing things and acquiring muscle memory of this different way of doing things. And I'm very hopeful about the younger generation, that they have grown up in this world of interactive communication. They're and simply unwilling to accept the things that older generations put up with, that you work in this big lumbering bureaucracy for years and years. The younger generation is basically saying, well, that's not for me, because one, you can't promise a career anyway, so why am I sticking around? So long as you have something for me today, I'll be here, but the moment I see a better opportunity, I'll be on my way. And this is a big shock for organizations who are used to having employees as captives, if you like, for long periods. Basically, that's over. So there's a whole new world opening up. The communications, the young generation, and the recognition that the old way isn't working, just even on their own terms, it's failing. So that there's a new world opening up in front of our eyes. And, it will happen. It will happen either slowly and in an ugly fashion with a whole lot of fight back, or it will happen, and what I'm obviously trying to do is accelerate and make it happen easily and elegantly and intelligently, and point out to people, look, there is a better way.
So you've led me down a very interesting thought process, and I'll tell you briefly.
Organizations which have already done it.
Douglas McGregor,
so why don't we get into this mode?
drive, and the understanding we've had about compensation of knowledge workers, which obviously gets completely ignored and in many ways is a part of, could be argued as a part of the financial collapse. Those who believe in the cycles of history, I wonder if your muscle memory metaphor is actually kind of instructive. Meaning, do you have to go through a crisis in order to get to the kind of change we're talking about? And if not, how could someone, say, who's in a school, who reads your material and really likes it, how could they move forward in such a way as to avoid the crisis but precipitate the change?
Well, I don't really believe that you have to go through a horrendous crisis. I mean, if action isn't taken, that's what will happen. We will have these increasingly horrendous crises, and eventually something will happen. But I mean, as a species, we have been smart enough to see the writing on the wall, and so the writing is on the wall about the past way of doing things, and in a sense, we know how to do it differently. So I'm hopeful that we can see that, and I mean, those who have been able to see it join together, band together with others who can see it, form groups, form communities, and become the revolution. Lead this change. Make it happen. I mean, it always starts with one person, and then two, and then three, and then four, and as it spreads, you have more and more groups seeing this, understanding it, finding more champions, linking up together, using social media or whatever means to band together to accelerate this and to make it happen quickly and intelligently. We don't have to go through a few more massive financial crises to realize that there's a fundamental problem, and we already know that. It's a question of using our smarts to grasp that and to have the courage to stand up and say, look, this is better. This is a different way. It's maybe strange, but it's obviously better. And what's more, the way in which we've currently been doing things is failing. Here are the statistics.
So that is a really nice segue into
we know it. We can
this
see
question
it.
of
We
storytelling,
can feel it.
because it would seem that storytelling becomes a critical part of helping to facilitate those changes. And if we look at education and the stories that are being told currently, especially by our president in the Department of Education, there's a sense that those stories aren't actually addressing the current needs. So what role does storytelling here, and what could we learn about storytelling that would make a difference in how we approach the circumstance?
Yeah, well, I got into storytelling because I was a desperate man. I was in the World Bank and trying to spark change in the organization, and with what I thought was a blindingly obvious idea, but no one was listening. And it wasn't until I stumbled on the power of a story that I was actually able to get people to listen, and then fairly soon, suddenly, the whole organization was responding. And so I spent 4 years in the World Bank using stories to change that, and then the last 10 years coaching other organizations on how to use the power of story to do this. And so the book, to answer Greg's question, which companies exemplify the behavior, I mean, in Terry's question, there are a number of positive stories in the organizations of companies that exemplify the behavior. And for the most part, they're not big companies. They are small to medium companies. The largest company in the book would be Salesforce.com, which is only 11 years old, but it's now worth $17 billion. So it's become very big, very fast. And that's what happens when you do this. You grow very quickly because you become very successful. But there are really sort of a considerable number of stories of organizations that are doing this, and it's stories that will inspire people to make this happen. The Montessori story is one that I put on my blog, and which I think is a great example in education, where I'm not an education expert, but as far as I can see, it exemplifies this whole spirit of learning in an education sector. And so I'd be telling stories about the Montessori schools and how they exemplify this change, and using those stories to inspire people.
But I'm intrigued because those of us who sort of live in this world, we've all got lots of stories, whether it's Sudbury schools or Big Picture schools or KIPP, or and they really span a variety of philosophies. But those stories don't seem to ever inform or reform the main narratives. So I need to study this a little further, because it feels as though there's an opportunity here that we're not grabbing.
Right. Well, I mean, in my work with organizations using story and with leaders to use the power of story, is that I coach people on what will be an effective story, what will be a story that will inspire people to want to change. And there's a certain pattern of stories that does that. And I mean, the paradoxical thing is that although story is a very powerful way to communicate, if you look at the actual use of stories by leaders in politics and in organizations, I would say that on balance, more than half of those stories do not work. More than half of those stories are ineffective in communicating and inspiring change. And so my workshops are showing people, well, why is that so? What do you have to have in a story that will inspire change? And I mean, one part of it is that the story has to be a story in which the listener will perceive themselves in the story. In other words, you start from the listener, start from who are the people that you are trying to communicate something to, and what do they currently believe, and why do they not see the truth as you see it, and then finding a story in which they can perceive themselves in a different light. So it's likely to be a true story, a story that actually happened. So it's not an imaginary story. It's a story with a happy ending, a story with an inspiring, positive close, and it's told in a very minimalist fashion so that there's plenty of space for the listener to actually perceive themselves in the story. I mean, just to give an example of what this looks like in a leadership setting. I mean, I was trying to persuade the World Bank to share its knowledge. The World Bank, this big international lending organization, lends billions of dollars to poor countries to eliminate, reduce poverty. And I was trying to persuade the organization, why don't we share our knowledge? We could share our knowledge with all the people who make decisions about poverty. We could be a much more effective organization. And I couldn't get anyone to listen to this. This was in 1996 when I was trying to do this, and until I stumbled on a story. And the story is a very simple and quick one, and I can tell it to you right now. I'd be talking about the future and the future of the organization, and what's it going to be like? Well, I said it's going to be like today. Let me tell you about something that happened just a few months ago. In June 1995, this is in early 1996, but in June 1995, a health worker in a little village in Zambia, in Africa, logged onto the website for the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, and got the answer to a question on how to treat malaria. Now, that was June 1995, not June 2015. It wasn't the capital of Zambia. It was a little village 600 kilometers away. And this is not a rich country. This is Zambia, one of the poorest countries in the world. But you know the most important part of this picture for us in the World Bank? The World Bank is not in this picture. The World Bank does not have its knowledge organized to share with all the millions of people who make decisions about poverty. But just imagine if it was. Just imagine if we got organized. Think what an organization we could become. And yeah, that started to resonate first with staff and then managers And then the president heard about it. He said, right, let's do it. And so that story, it's only 29 words long, but it's about a true story. It actually happened. Go to Zambia, check it out. It actually happened. It's about something that ends in a very positive way. We got the answer to a question on how to treat malaria, and it's told in this very minimalist fashion so that the listener, if the story's working well, the listener can imagine a different world. And so in the education sector, what you'd be looking for is a similar kind of story where the listener could imagine themselves in a true story that's positive in tone and told in this very rapid fashion where they can imagine this different kind of world, and then you link it to the idea, what if? What if your school was being run this way? Just imagine the impact that this would have, with not just your school, but every school in your district. Think of the impact that would have if the whole country education system was being run in this fashion. It's inspiring the listener to imagine a new story. And so that's what we do in workshops on storytelling is show people how to craft stories that can pick up even the most difficult change-resistant audiences and, in a sense, hurl them into the future. I mean, the World Bank is a very change-resistant organization, but they were
I've just downloaded on my Kindle app
pretty much any audience
Guide to
is vulnerable to
Storytelling.
story.
So hopefully I'll have a better sense of this after reading that. What about visioning processes? What about helping groups to construct stories? What's the role of that in storytelling? Well, my discovery, well, one of my discoveries was that, I mean, future stories are about the most difficult stories to tell. I mean, you read a lot of leadership books and they talk about, well, the object of a leader is to tell a future story that will inspire people to follow them. Well, I said, well, that's great. Can you give me an example? And I found that there are only 3 examples that were ever given. One was Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream. The other was Churchill, we will fight them on the beaches. And then there was Kennedy, we'll put a man on the moon. So those are the only 3 stories that actually exemplified this telling future stories. And actually, the future story is about the most difficult story to tell because the future is so unknowable that it becomes a very implausible kind of story. So my strong advice is not to, in fact, to find a shortcut to that and to tell a story like the Zambia story, which is actually a story about the past, but which inspires the listener to imagine the future story. So I'm talking about something that's actually happened, but I'm inspiring the listener to imagine a future story. And in a sense, it's something that the science fiction writer William Gibson talked about, that the future is already here, it's just very unevenly distributed. So what you're doing with something like that Zambia story, you're pointing to part of the future that's already happened, and you're saying, why don't we make the future like that? And because it's already happened, I mean, you can't argue with it. It's happened. It happened in Zambia. June 1995, it actually happened. So you don't have the argument with future stories, well, that will never happen. If you are a poet, like Winston Churchill or Martin Luther King, then sure, use the future story. But you need to be a poet. The story about the past, you don't need to be a poet. Anyone can do it. It's very simple. It actually happened. It's very straightforward, and it put all of the listener does all of the hard work. And what's more, the listener imagines a future that's totally adapted to their own personal setting. I don't know what their personal setting is, but if the story is working well, they're imagining a future story in their own personal setting. So sort of a final question for me, and if you asked a question in the chat that I missed, I hope you'll put it back in, or
the productivity of communication.
But so a lot of our listeners are going to be people who don't feel like they're in power positions in their educational organizations. What advice do you give to them about finding and telling those compelling stories? How does someone who's not in a power position start telling those stories?
Well, I mean, one of the reasons why I was in that position in the World Bank trying to tell that story is that basically I was being kicked out of the World Bank at the time. The politics of the organization had changed. My boss had retired, and the president of the World Bank had suddenly died, and somebody else was being appointed to my position. I had no position. Basically, the management was trying to push me out the door. So this is not something that requires a power position. This is something where, in that particular case, I said, look, I'm actually not ready to be kicked out the door. I'm going to make this happen. And so I made a decision. I am going to commit myself to making this change happen, and I will do whatever it takes to make it happen. And I believed it was important enough to do that. And the curious thing was that once I did that, once I made that commitment, an all-out commitment, I am going to make this happen, things did start to happen. In fact, the organization started to respond, and the president changed. So it might have gone the other way. I could have been kicked out of the organization, and I would have said, well, fine, I thought it was worth doing, and I still believe that. But this is about actually having a life worth living. It's about having a life where you say, look, here is something that I feel is worth doing, something I care about. I am going to make it happen. One might be in a situation where one doesn't have that luxury. You might not have the financial means to sustain it if you are thrown out of the organization. But it's about having a meaningful life and saying, I'm going to stand up for what I believe is what is right, what must happen, what needs to happen, and having the courage to join with others to make it happen. And so it's about having a meaningful life. It's about having a life that actually makes a difference. And so my strong suggestion is, if you want to have a meaningful life, this is about taking up the challenge, learning how to communicate, inspire other people, understand why things are going the way they are, and understanding how they should be doing differently, and inspiring
use of social media
other champions,
as
other
a way
colleagues
of
who share the same vision to make
gathering around colleagues who think similarly would provide for some of that strength to be able to stand up in your own sort of local organization and say, hey, I think this is really important. Whereas prior to those connections we had in social media, we might have felt less emboldened. So hopefully that's a sign of hope. So we're pretty much close to the end of the show. If anybody has a final question, we'll let you take it. Steve, I really want to thank you for coming on the show. That was just fascinating. I hope you're right. I have a feeling the crisis piece is going to stick with me for a little while. I'm a little afraid we'll have a hard time making the changes just because we want to. But I really appreciate it. I loved the book. It's called The Leader's Guide to Radical Management, Reinventing the Workplace for the 21st Century. I think it has significant implications for education and the environment in which teachers work. We did have a show earlier, I think about 2 years ago, on teachers as partners in running schools. And I'm also kind of intrigued by the degree to which in some chartered schools we're probably going to find more democratic processes with the teachers being involved in how the schools get run. Any final thoughts, Steve?
Well, yeah, I think the social media point is really quite dramatic. If Egypt can do it, if Tunisia can do
Thanks
it,
so much,
Syria
Steve.
can do it.
Really appreciate your being here.
What's holding
Thanks
us
everybody
back?
for coming.
Let's
clapping
make this
again.
revolution happen.
I did download, what's it called here, the Leader's Guide to Storytelling. I'll send you an email, let you know if I've found the answer. But thanks for coming to the Future of Education. Coming up tomorrow, Sir Ken Robinson again on his revised book, Out of Our Minds. Thanks, Steve. Have a great night.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. It's a good message. So we let you go on time.
Join the revolution.
Taken a full hour, and so feel free just to close out by clicking the X, Steve, on the top right of your screen are going to file an exit. Those of you who'd like to stick around for a couple minutes, I'll stick in the chat, but then we will close the session out so the recording can process. Take care. Good night. And that great job, Steve, could either be you or me, so let's both take it. Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. No, thanks, and fun talking with you tonight.
Oh, that's a terrific offer. Does anybody have any final questions? There was one that got mentioned here. Harry wanted to
stick around for a minute or two if anyone has any
questions. Of Fire My Boss, where the job is just to earn a living, so find the highest paying, so on your own time you can do your passion, moral needs. Sounds like that would be... Go ahead.
Well, I'm not too keen on firing the boss. I'm more inclined to inspiring my boss to see the world differently, and to, essentially that's what I was doing in the World Bank. I didn't fire my bosses. I inspired them to see the world differently, and inspired a lot of colleagues and to start acting very differently, so that they didn't need to be fired. They simply started to view the world differently, and so I'm not too keen on living one's passion in the evenings and weekends. I'm keen on actually living my passion on my day job. I'm spending most of my time in working hours. I don't want that to be downtime. I want that to be meaningful. I want that to be part of my passion and my moral needs. So it's about creating
Steve, do you know Ricardo Semler in Brazil?
One's whole life is passionate and meaningful and responsive to moral needs.
So did they end up being a good example of this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know him, but I've read about him, yes. And yeah, I haven't really gone back and looked at whether some of these more detailed principles that I describe in the book are reflected there, but the idea that his thinking that one lives a meaningful life.
In a previous life, I had an experience. I ran a
main thrust
company that did a subcontracting process for Hewlett-Packard. And we were very much into Deming and Edward de Bono, and we had huge improvements over the previous subcontractor in the range of 400 to 500% improvements. And we did so by allowing the team to kind of define their own processes and get engaged. And they actually had a once-a-week book reading program where they read a business book together and talked about how they could implement those things in their team. And we got shut down fairly quickly. The first thing that happened was we were told that we couldn't hold the book reading program because it looked like we weren't working to the other subcontractors. And then in a very fast fashion, we actually lost the contract, even though we were performing phenomenally. What is it that happens in these situations where is this, again, I want to go back to the cognitive. Is there a response that people have to this sometimes which is the exact opposite of what you hoped for? That you would expect them to say hooray and yet they want to shut it down?
Well, it's exactly that kind of experience that led me to write this book, because I saw in knowledge management that basically all of the great knowledge management programs were shut down in a similar fashion. I mean, the world famous programs, and BP and IBM and Ernst & Young, and all of those programs got closed down. And similar things happen in storytelling. And similar things happen in innovation, and similar things happen in marketing, and similar things happen in lean, and similar things happen in software development. So I saw in all of these different fields, it wasn't the particular thing that was being closed down. There was a kind of systematic destruction of anything that was creative and energizing and innovative in the organization. So I started to look into why was this so? Why were these intelligent people acting in this very unintelligent fashion? And that's how I stumbled on the fact that, in fact, they had this underlying set of assumptions, this mental model of how to run an organization that systematically led to those results. And then I started to see, well, is there an alternative? Is there another? And so the book is about organizations which have a different mental model, a different interlocking set of assumptions. And that's the one reason why these things get closed down, is because they change one of the things in that mental model, but they leave the other things in place. And say you introduce teams or quality, it changes part of the assumptions, but you still have the making money for the shareholders and individual reporting to bosses and giving commands, and those set of assumptions then basically crush the innovative activity. So it's realizing that you need systemic change, that any one of these things is not going to make a difference. And so it's a very pervasive problem. You look at most business books, you look at business schools, you look at what consultants actually bring into organizations. They're all operating off this traditional mental model, which destroys all of these things. So the book is partly a warning to say, look out for these people, because they have this mental model which will kill what you're doing, even if you have productivity gains of 500%. Doesn't matter how much.
Any connection with the prisoner's dilemma?
You'll still be crushed.
Is there any degree to which cooperative, sort of
the mental model,
collaboratively built solutions are vulnerable to somebody who feels like they can take advantage of that moment?
I don't believe so. I don't. This is a set of assumptions which is not liable to be manipulated by freeloaders. It's in fact, because it's so transparent, it's immediately apparent what's going on. I mean, it's frighteningly transparent, and that's one reason why some companies back away, is because it's so shockingly transparent that all of these routines that you see with freeloaders and whatnot, and cover your backside routines going up and down the hierarchy, those things are immediately exposed. And so in a bureaucracy, when you introduce it at the first, all of that stuff tumbles out on the table, and you're suddenly looking at this huge pile of garbage. And often the reaction is, well, my gosh, this caused all that garbage. But in fact, the garbage was always there. It just exposed the garbage that was there. And so the organizations that succeed are those that say, well, we need to clean the garbage up. Then if you say, well, we're going to shovel the garbage back into the closet, then obviously the organization doesn't change. So it's frighteningly transparent, and in that sense, not at all like the prisoner's dilemma, where it encourages people to look after themselves. This is about exposing all of those routines and making them in practice impossible to carry out. I mean, just one practice that is really quite striking in these organizations is a daily stand-up in the morning where every member of the team says, what did I do yesterday? What did I do what am I going to do today, and what impediments are getting in the way of my work. When every member of the team does that over a sustained period, everybody knows everything. There's no hiding. Everybody knows exactly who's contributing what and what's happening in the group. And for some people,
there's a fascinating parallel between
once you
that
do this,
and
then you can
what are
you
called
have the
advisories in some schools. It's an early morning block where it's not about any particular subject, but it is sort of, are you on track? How are things going? What can we do to help you? At some point, I'm going to try and dive into that comparison, because it feels as though, again, your discussion exists at two fascinating levels. One of which is the teacher as employee or worker, and the second is the student actually as co-worker in the creation of their own education, and how do those practices actually go down to that level when you view the student as the co-creator or the creator of their own education.
Right.
Terrific. Yes. Thank you, Steve.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to talk more about
that. I really appreciate it. I left the recorder on, so we've captured
we have to run now.
Have a great night. Take care.
It's been fun
Thanks
being
for
with
coming.
you, and let's stay in touch.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. Really appreciate it. I am going to close the room down so the recording can process.
All the best.
Take care and good night.